They said the mountain would bury him one day, that a man who builds his home where the wind never sleeps is either brave or broken, and most of them decided Ethan Cole was both. Just not in the way that earns respect, because from the road his cabin looked wrong. Too low against the ridge, too thick in the walls, the windows narrow like watchful eyes instead of something meant for comfort. And the townspeople would slow their trucks just long enough to shake their heads, calling it a fool's shelter, a place no sane man would choose when there were warm lodges just 12 miles down the pass, with heated floors, polished wood, and fireplaces that burned for show instead of survival. But Ethan never argued, never stepped out onto the porch to defend what he built. He would just stand there sometimes at dawn with Ranger beside him, a full-grown German shepherd with a sable coat darkened along the spine like a shadow that refused to leave, both of them facing the horizon as if waiting for something the rest of the world had forgotten how to see. And on that particular morning the air carried a taste that didn't belong to early winter, something sharper than cold, something that settled on the tongue like a warning you couldn't quite name. While down in town laughter echoed from the parking lot of the resort, where SUVs lined up in perfect rows, families unloading skis, cases of wine, bright jackets that hadn't yet met real weather, their voices easy, careless, a man in a pressed wool coat joking loudly about the crazy seal up the ridge, saying if the storm rumors were true, he'd rather trust modern engineering than some bunker built by a guy who couldn't let go of the past, and his friends laughed with him, the sound carrying thin and hollow against the rising wind, because none of them noticed how the sky had begun to flatten into a pale, endless gray, how the sunlight lost its warmth without dimming, how even the birds had gone quiet hours earlier. But Ranger noticed, his ears lifting before the first gust came. Not strong, not loud, just different, threading through the trees with a low, steady whisper that made him step closer to Ethan's side, amber eyes fixed on the ridgeline, and Ethan felt it too, not as fear, not even as concern, but as recognition, the kind that settles deep in your chest when you've seen something once and survived it only because you learned too late what it could do. His gloved hand resting briefly on the cabin door, solid oak reinforced with steel beneath the grain. Every inch of that place built with a memory he never spoke about. Every beam measured against a night that had taken more than it gave back. And as the first real wind rolled down the mountain, carrying with it the scent of distant snow not yet fallen, Ethan exhaled slowly, almost like a prayer, while miles below, laughter continued. Engines shut off, doors slammed, people stepping into comfort they believed would hold, unaware that the storm already had its eyes on them. And up on the ridge, where the world narrowed to silence and steel and breath, a man and his dog turned toward a cabin the rest of the town had called foolish, and prepared for something that never cared what anyone believed. By noon the temperature had dropped nearly 15 degrees in less than an hour, not the slow, honest kind of cold that gave you time to adjust, but a sharp, deliberate descent that pressed against the skin like a warning you could not ignore. And Ethan moved through the cabin with quiet precision, checking each latch, each hinge, each narrow window designed not for view but for endurance, his movements practiced, almost ritual, as if he had done this 100 times before. Even though storms like this did not come often, not anymore, and yet he built as if they would, while Ranger tracked him step for step, claws clicking softly against the reinforced floor, pausing only to glance toward the door whenever the wind shifted, his body alert but not anxious, because this was not fear, this was purpose. And outside the first veil of snow began to fall, thin at first, drifting sideways instead of down, carried by a wind that had not yet found its full voice, while down in the valley the resort lights flickered once, then steadied, laughter still spilling out from the lodge as guests gathered near the massive stone fireplace, glasses raised, boots drying, someone remarking how beautiful the snowfall looked through the wide glass windows that stretched from floor to ceiling, never designed to withstand anything more than a postcard storm. And a woman in a bright red jacket stepped closer to the glass, watching the snow thicken, her smile fading just slightly as the wind pressed harder, flattening flakes against the surface like something testing its strength, while a staff member adjusted the thermostat, assuring everyone that backup generators were ready, that everything was under control. Words that sounded solid but carried no weight beyond the room they filled, and miles above. Then Ethan secured the final bolt on the outer door, the heavy metal sliding into place with a dull, certain sound, the kind that did not need to be checked twice. Then he paused, just for a moment, his hand resting against the cold surface, eyes distant, not looking at the cabin but through it, as if seeing another place entirely, another night where the wind had howled louder than thought and the world had turned white without mercy. And he inhaled slowly, steady, grounding himself in the present, because this time was different. This time he had built something that would hold, and Ranger let out a low, almost inaudible rumble, not a growl, not a warning, but an acknowledgement, as if he too understood the weight of what was coming. And then the power lines below snapped into darkness one by one, not with a dramatic crash, but with a quiet surrender, lights blinking out across the valley like stars disappearing before dawn. And inside the resort the music cut mid-note, replaced by a brief, confused silence that stretched just long enough for unease to settle in, before the generators kicked in with a delayed hum, lights returning but dimmer now, softer, the room no longer quite the same, and someone laughed it off, too quickly, too loud, while outside the wind found its full strength at last, rolling down the mountain in a single, relentless force that swallowed sound and distance alike, turning roads into memory and direction into guesswork. And up on the ridge the cabin did not move, did not creak, did not protest. It simply stood, absorbing the storm the way it had been built to. While inside, Ethan lit a small lantern, not because he needed it, but because habit told him light mattered when the world outside disappeared. And as the flames steadied, casting a warm, controlled glow across walls built for survival, he finally spoke, his voice low, calm, meant more for the dog than for himself, saying, "We stay ready." And Ranger settled beside the door, eyes fixed forward, as if guarding not just the cabin, but the fragile line between those who prepared and those who believed they would never have to. By late afternoon, the storm had fully claimed the mountain, not as a sudden explosion of chaos, but as a slow, tightening grip that left no space untouched, the wind no longer shifting but constant now, pressing against every surface with a steady, unbroken force that made even the air inside the resort feel thinner, heavier. And though the generators continued their low hum, the lights flickered just enough to remind everyone that control was an illusion they were borrowing, not owning, and the wide glass windows that once framed a beautiful snowfall had turned into pale, opaque walls of white, nothing visible beyond a few feet, no trees, no road, no horizon, just movement without direction. And one by one conversations began to quiet, replaced by glances, by small questions spoken under breath. How long would this last? When would the roads be cleared? When would help arrive? And no one had answers that felt real, not even the staff who moved through the lodge with rehearsed calm, that could not quite hide the uncertainty in their eyes, while a man near the fireplace, the same one who had laughed earlier, pulled out his phone only to find no signal, his expression shifting not into panic, but into something more fragile, disbelief, as if the world had quietly stepped out from under him, and outside the wind howled louder, not sharp but deep, like something alive moving through the valley. And far above them the cabin remained still, anchored against the ridge with a quiet defiance that did not need to be proven, because it had already been tested long before this storm arrived. And inside, Ethan sat at the small wooden table, a map spread out beneath the lantern light, though he was not studying it. Not really. His eyes resting on familiar lines while his mind traced something older, something heavier, the memory of another white horizon where distance vanished and time stretched thin, where every decision carried weight that could not be undone. And he closed his eyes for a moment, not to escape, but to steady himself, because this time there was no mission, no orders, just a choice. And Ranger shifted beside him, lifting his head as if sensing the change, ears angled toward the door as a new sound joined the storm, faint at first, almost lost beneath the wind, a distant echo that did not belong to the mountain. And Ethan stood without hesitation, crossing the room in a few quiet steps, unbolting the small reinforced viewing panel beside the door, opening it just enough to let the outside world press in for a heartbeat. And there it was again, clearer now, not a voice, not exactly, but something close enough to carry meaning, a call shaped by urgency rather than clarity, and Ethan did not speak, did not react outwardly. But something in his posture shifted, the stillness giving way to readiness, while miles below the resort had begun to change in ways no one could ignore anymore. The heat, uneven now, pockets of warmth and cold spreading through the building, supplies being counted instead of assumed, staff moving faster, voices lower, and someone suggested waiting it out while someone else suggested leaving before it got worse, neither understanding that worse had already arrived. And in that quiet confusion, where comfort began to crack but had not yet broken, a decision lingered unmade. While up on the ridge, Ethan closed the panel and reached for his coat, the thick, weathered fabric worn in all the places that mattered, his hand brushing briefly against Ranger's head, a silent exchange that needed no words. And as the storm pressed harder against the cabin walls, as the world outside narrowed to nothing but white and wind, Ethan opened the main door just a few inches, letting the cold rush in sharp and immediate, not as an enemy, but as something familiar, something he understood, and somewhere out there, beyond sight, beyond certainty, someone was moving through that storm without knowing how close they were to losing their way. And for the first time since the wind began, Ethan stepped forward into it, not because he had to, but because he chose to. The wind hit him like a wall the moment the door opened wider, not sudden but absolute, a force that erased edges and distance, turning the world into nothing but motion and cold, and Ethan stepped into it without hesitation, pulling the door closed behind him with a firm, practiced motion that sealed the warmth inside, while Ranger moved ahead, low to the ground, body cutting through the drift as if the storm parted just enough to let him pass. His nose lifted, reading something deeper than sight, and within seconds the cabin was gone from view, swallowed whole by white, leaving only memory to mark where safety stood, and Ethan did not look back, because looking back was how people lost direction, how they let doubt take root. Instead, he fixed his eyes on Ranger's silhouette, the only anchor that mattered now, each step deliberate, boots pressing into snow that had already begun to harden under the relentless wind, the cold biting through layers not as pain, but as pressure, constant and unforgiving. And the sound came again, clearer now between gusts, a broken call carried unevenly through the storm, not strong enough to guide itself, but enough for someone who knew how to listen, and Ethan adjusted his path slightly, trusting instinct shaped by years that had taught him the mountain did not forgive hesitation. While below, inside the resort, the first real shift had taken hold, the kind that changed the way people looked at one another, conversations no longer casual, movements tighter, measured, someone suggesting they should stay together, someone else pacing near the entrance doors that refused to open more than a few inches against the wind, the outside pressing back as if it had weight of its own, and the man who had laughed earlier now stood silent, arms folded, eyes fixed on the blank glass, not seeing the storm but feeling it, realizing too late that comfort had limits he had never needed to consider. And then a faint knocking sound reached them, so soft at first it could have been dismissed as part of the wind, but it came again, uneven, human, and heads turned, conversations cut short, a staff member stepping cautiously toward the door, hesitating just long enough to let doubt pass through the room, before pulling it open against resistance. And for a brief moment the storm rushed in, loud and blinding, filling the entryway with white before revealing shapes within it. Two figures stumbling forward, coated in snow, their movements slow not from injury, but from exhaustion, eyes wide, searching, and the room shifted all at once, people moving, voices rising, questions spilling out without answers. While outside, Ethan moved closer to that same fragile edge between losing and finding, Ranger slowing, circling once, then pressing forward again with renewed certainty. And through the shifting veil of snow a faint outline began to form ahead, not a building, not shelter, but something smaller, a broken trail of footprints already half erased, leading nowhere and everywhere at once. And Ethan followed without pause, knowing that footprints meant someone had been here not long ago, knowing that in a storm like this time was measured differently, not in minutes, but in chances. And as the wind surged again, louder now, deeper, carrying with it a weight that pressed even harder against breath and thought, Ranger stopped suddenly, body rigid, ears forward, and let out a sharp bark that cut clean through the noise. And there, just beyond the next rise, barely visible against the endless white, a figure moved, unsteady, turning in slow, uncertain circles as if the world had spun too far for direction to make sense anymore. And Ethan did not call out, did not rush. He closed the distance with steady steps, each one anchored in control, until he was close enough to be seen, and the figure froze, as if unsure whether what stood before them was real or imagined. And in that suspended moment, where the storm swallowed everything but the space between two people, Ethan spoke, calm and clear, saying, "You are not alone." And it was not loud, not forced, but it carried, because sometimes the simplest words are the ones that hold. The figure did not answer at first, not because they did not hear him, but because the words took a moment to reach through the noise and the cold and the quiet panic that had settled deep in their chest. And when they finally moved, it was not toward him, but slightly to the side, as if unsure which direction was real anymore, their breath visible in short, uneven bursts, hands trembling not from fear alone, but from the kind of exhaustion that comes when the body begins to lose its sense of urgency. And Ethan closed the distance carefully, not rushing, not grabbing, just stepping into their line of sight until the choice became simple, until there was only one direction left to take, and Ranger circled behind them. Once, gently, guiding without pressure, his presence steady, unspoken, and the person blinked hard, eyes focusing at last on something solid, something that did not move with the wind, and their voice came out rough, barely more than a whisper, saying, "I cannot find the road." And Ethan nodded once, as if that had already been understood long before it was said, replying, "You do not need to. Just follow me." And there was no explanation, no reassurance layered in comfort, just clarity, the kind that holds stronger than warmth in a moment like this. And the person hesitated only a second longer before stepping forward, boots dragging slightly through the snow, and together they turned back into the storm, Ranger taking the lead again, his path subtle but certain, weaving just enough to avoid the deeper drifts, his body language shifting with each gust, as if reading the mountain itself. And behind them the wind erased their tracks almost instantly, leaving no sign they had ever been there, while down at the resort the arrival of the first two had changed everything. Their presence a quiet proof that the storm was no longer something to watch, but something that reached in and took hold. And voices rose again, not in laughter now, but in urgency. People asking how far they had gone, what they had seen, whether the road was still there. And the answers came fragmented, uncertain, one of them shaking their head, saying, "It is gone. I could not see anything. Just white, just wind." And a silence followed that felt heavier than the storm itself, because for the first time the idea of being trapped settled into the room with weight that could not be dismissed, and someone suggested calling for help again. Someone else said the lines were down, and the staff moved faster now, gathering blankets, checking doors, speaking in lower voices that carried a different kind of authority, while outside Ethan kept his pace steady, not slowing, not pushing faster than the person behind him could manage, because speed meant nothing if it broke rhythm, and rhythm was what kept people moving when strength began to fade. And once, just once, the person stumbled, their knee dipping into the snow, and Ranger stopped instantly, turning back, pressing close enough to anchor without force, and Ethan reached out then, not pulling but steadying his grip firm and brief, enough to remind without overwhelming, saying, "Keep your steps even, one at a time." And the person nodded, swallowing hard, focusing on the next step instead of the distance ahead, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, the shape of the world began to change, not clearer, not visible, but different, the wind shifting slightly, the ground leveling beneath their feet, and Ranger's posture lifted, his pace quickening by just a fraction, and Ethan saw it, recognized it, and angled slightly to the left, trusting what could not yet be seen. And then, through the veil of white, a darker line emerged, faint at first, then steadier, the outline of something that held against the storm instead of being swallowed by it. And the person behind him let out a breath that sounded almost like disbelief, because hope does not arrive loudly in moments like this. It appears quietly, in shapes that do not move, in things that remain when everything else is taken. And as they drew closer, the cabin revealed itself not as shelter alone, but as something earned, something built to stand where nothing else could, and Ethan did not slow as he reached the door, did not pause for relief. He simply opened it, stepping aside just enough to let the person pass through first, into the warmth that waited inside, while Ranger followed close behind, and for a brief moment, as the door remained open against the storm, the line between outside and inside stood visible, thin and fragile, before closing once more with a solid, certain sound that shut the wind out and held the quiet in. Warmth did not rush in all at once. It settled slowly, like something careful, something earned, wrapping around the person as they stood just inside the door, unsure whether to move or simply breathe, their shoulders still tense as if the storm might reach through the walls and pull them back. And Ethan closed the door with a firm motion, sealing it tight before sliding the bolts into place one by one, each click steady, deliberate, a rhythm that carried more reassurance than any words could offer, while Ranger shook the snow from his coat in a brief, controlled motion, then moved to the hearth where a low fire burned not for comfort alone but for function, its heat consistent, contained, the kind that lasted, and the person finally stepped forward, drawn toward it without thinking, hands hovering near the warmth, not too close, just enough to feel something return to their fingers. And for a moment there was only the sound of the wind pressing against the outside and the soft crackle of wood inside, two worlds separated by inches of reinforced wall, and Ethan did not interrupt that silence. He moved with quiet purpose, retrieving a heavy wool blanket from a shelf and placing it over the person's shoulders without ceremony, then setting a metal cup near the fire to warm, his actions simple, practiced, leaving no space for confusion, and the person exhaled slowly, the tension easing just enough to let words come back, asking how far they had come, and Ethan answered without turning, saying far enough, and it was not distance he meant, and they seemed to understand that, nodding once, eyes drifting around the cabin, taking in the details now that the storm no longer filled every sense. The walls thicker than expected, the windows narrow, the door reinforced in ways that spoke of intention rather than fear, and something shifted in their expression, not quite realization, but the beginning of it. While outside the resort had moved beyond uncertainty into something sharper, the heat now uneven enough to notice, certain corners colder than others, people gathering closer together not out of habit but necessity, blankets distributed, voices lower, and someone suggested they might need to ration supplies if the storm lasted longer than expected, a sentence that landed heavier than it should have, because no one had planned for time to stretch beyond comfort. And the man who had once laughed stood near the entrance again, staring at the door as if it might answer something for him, his reflection faint against the glass, and for the first time he spoke without humor, asking how far the nearest shelter was, and no one answered immediately, because the word shelter had changed its meaning. While miles above, Ethan finally turned, studying the person with a calm that did not judge, only measured, asking how many were left down there, and the answer came slower this time, the weight of it settling in as it was spoken, too many, and the words hung in the air between them, simple, undeniable, and Ethan nodded once, not surprised, just confirming what he had already sensed, and Ranger lifted his head from beside the fire, ears forward again, eyes moving between them as if tracking something deeper than sound, and the wind outside surged, louder now, pressing harder against the cabin as if testing its limits. And Ethan stepped toward the small table, unrolling the map again, this time not looking through it but at it, tracing a line with one finger that led from the resort up toward the ridge, not a road, not a path anyone would choose without reason, and he spoke quietly, more to the room than to the person, saying they will try to come up when it gets worse, because people always move when waiting becomes heavier than fear, and the person's eyes widened slightly, understanding forming not as panic but as clarity, and for a moment the firelight flickered between them, casting shadows that stretched and shifted along the reinforced walls, and the cabin held steady, not just against the storm, but against the weight of what was coming next, and Ethan reached for his coat again, not rushing, not hesitating, while Ranger rose to his feet without being called, already knowing that the line between inside and outside was about to open once more. The second time the door opened that night, it was not for one person but for many, though none of them knew yet how close they were to the only place left that could hold against what the mountain had become. And far below at the resort, the decision had finally broken through hesitation, not as courage but as necessity, a small group gathering near the entrance, layered in whatever warmth they could find. Faces pale in the dim emergency lighting, their voices quieter now, stripped of certainty. While the man who once laughed stood among them without speaking, his earlier confidence gone, replaced by something heavier, something closer to humility. And when the doors pushed open, the wind surged in like a living force, knocking breath back into their throats, snow cutting sideways across the threshold. And for a moment, none of them moved, held in place by the sheer difference between watching the storm and stepping into it, until one of them took the first step forward and the rest followed, because standing still had become more dangerous than moving. And within seconds, the world swallowed them whole, the resort disappearing behind them as if it had never existed. While up on the ridge, Ethan moved again into that same white silence. Ranger already ahead, his pace steady, unbroken, guiding without looking back, and the cold wrapped tighter this time, sharper, the wind stronger, pushing harder against every step as if aware of their purpose. And Ethan angled his path toward where he knew the slope would dip, where movement from below would naturally be drawn, not by sight but by instinct, because even without direction, people moved toward what felt like less resistance. And that was where he would find them. And the storm answered with a deeper howl, the sound rolling across the mountain like a warning no one could translate. While the group below struggled forward, their formation breaking apart almost immediately, each step uneven, each breath harder to control, someone calling out, but the wind tearing the words away before they could land. And the man who had once laughed stumbled, slightly, catching himself with a hand against the snow, his gloves already stiffening, his eyes searching for something to anchor to and finding nothing. Only motion, only white. And for the first time, he understood what it meant to not know where you were, not in a simple way, but in the kind of way that pulled at your sense of self. And he straightened, forcing himself forward again, because stopping felt worse, while ahead of them, unseen but closer with each step, Ranger slowed, his head lifting, ears cutting through the wind with focused precision, and then he shifted direction slightly, not sharply, just enough to change the line, and Ethan followed without question, trusting the dog more than the storm, more than the mountain, more than memory itself. And then, faint at first but unmistakable, shapes began to move within the white, not still like trees, not solid like rock, but uneven, uncertain. And Ethan raised one hand slightly, not to signal, but to steady his own pace, approaching without urgency, because rushing into fear only scattered it further. And as the distance closed, the figures became clearer, a cluster of people struggling to stay together, their movements slowed by exhaustion, their voices lost to the wind. And one of them turned, seeing Ethan and Ranger as if they had stepped out of the storm itself, disbelief flashing across their face before something else took over, something raw and immediate, hope. And Ethan did not speak right away. He stepped closer until the space between them held, until they could see him clearly, until the storm could no longer erase the fact that he was real. And then he said, simply, "Follow the dog." And Ranger turned without hesitation, already moving back toward the ridge, his path sure, his body cutting a line through the chaos. And for a moment, the group hesitated, the instinct to question still lingering, until the man who had once laughed took a step forward, not because he was certain, but because he finally understood that certainty was no longer required, only trust. And one by one they followed, leaving behind the place they had believed would protect them, and moving toward the one they had called foolish, while the storm closed in behind them, erasing everything except the choice they had just made. The line between them and the cabin was not measured in miles but in moments, in steps that had to be taken without hesitation. And as Ranger moved ahead through the storm, the group followed in a fragile rhythm, each person trying to match the pace set by something that did not doubt, while Ethan stayed just behind them, not leading, not pushing, but holding the shape of the movement together, watching for the subtle signs that came before collapse. The uneven step, the pause that lasted too long, the breath that broke its pattern. And once, when one of them began to drift slightly off the path, drawn by nothing more than the illusion of space in the white, Ranger cut back immediately, circling close, guiding them inward again with quiet insistence. And the person corrected without being told, because in the storm even small corrections carried weight, and time stretched in a way that made distance feel uncertain, the wind constant, the cold pressing deeper. But something had changed now, something invisible but real, the presence of direction, and that alone kept them moving. While the man who had once laughed found himself watching the dog more than the ground beneath his feet, each step placed not by his own judgment, but by trust he had not known he could give, and it steadied him in a way nothing else had. His breath still heavy, his body still strained, but his movement no longer scattered, and ahead, almost imperceptible at first, the wind shifted again, not weaker, not gone, but different, broken slightly by something that stood against it, and Ranger lifted his head higher, his pace increasing just enough to signal what could not yet be seen, and Ethan saw it in the way the dog moved, in the angle of his shoulders, and he allowed himself a single glance forward, searching through the endless white, until a darker shape began to take form, not moving, not fading, something that held. And as they drew closer, the outline sharpened into something unmistakable, the cabin rising out of the storm not as shelter alone, but as certainty, its low structure cutting against the wind, its walls absorbing what the mountain sent without yielding, and a sound passed through the group, not quite a voice, more like a shared breath released at once, because hope in a storm does not arrive loudly. It settles in the chest and lifts what weight it can, and Ethan did. Not slow, did not allow the sight of safety to break their rhythm, because the final steps were often the hardest, the moment when focus slipped and the body gave in too soon, and Ranger reached the door first, turning once, waiting, ensuring all were there, his presence steady even as the wind pressed hardest at this point, and Ethan moved forward then, opening the door with a firm motion, the warmth inside spilling out just enough to meet them halfway, and one by one they crossed that threshold, stepping out of the storm and into something solid, something built to hold, their movements slower now not from exhaustion alone, but from the sudden shift, the realization that they had made it somewhere they once dismissed, and as the last person stepped inside, Ethan closed the door again, sealing it with the same deliberate care, the bolts sliding into place with a finality that marked the end of something they could not yet fully understand, and for a moment no one spoke. The sound of the wind muffled behind reinforced walls, the fire steady, the air warm in a way that felt almost unreal, and the man who had once laughed stood near the center of the room, looking around at the thick walls, the narrow windows, the structure that had seemed excessive before, and he lowered his head slightly, not in defeat but in recognition, as if something inside him had shifted quietly into place. And across the room Ethan removed his gloves, setting them aside without ceremony, his movements calm, unchanged, while Ranger settled near the door once more, watchful, as if guarding not just the entrance, but the fragile understanding that had just been earned. And outside the storm continued without pause, but inside, for the first time that night, it no longer had the final word. Morning did not arrive with sunlight, but with silence, the kind that settles slowly after something immense has passed, and inside the cabin the air felt different, not just warmer but steadier, as if the storm had taken its voice elsewhere, leaving behind only the quiet proof that it had been there at all. And one by one the people who had gathered through the night began to stir, movements slow, careful, as though they were waking inside a place they did not fully trust yet, not because it felt unsafe, but because it felt unfamiliar in its strength, and the fire had burned low but steady, coals glowing with a soft, persistent heat that required no attention to remain, and Ethan was already awake, seated near the table with the same calm presence he had held before the storm reached its peak, his posture unchanged, his attention outward, listening not for danger now, but for absence, and Ranger lay near the door, head resting on his paws, eyes half open but alert in the way only a dog who has kept watch through the night can be. And for a moment no one spoke, the quiet filling the space where fear had been, until someone stepped toward the narrow window, wiping away a thin layer of frost with the side of their glove, and what they saw was not dramatic, not breathtaking, but simple. The storm had passed, leaving behind a landscape reshaped, the snow deep and unbroken, the sky pale and open above it, and the road that had once led clearly through the valley was gone, erased beneath drifts that stretched as far as the eye could follow, and a soft murmur moved through the room, not relief exactly, but understanding, because survival does not always come with celebration. Sometimes it comes quietly, in the realization that what could have been lost was not. And the man who had once laughed stood a few steps back, watching the others, then the walls, then finally Ethan, as if trying to find the right way to say something that could not be made simple, and he stepped forward slowly, not out of obligation, but because something in him had shifted enough to require it. And when he spoke, his voice was lower than before, stripped of the confidence it once carried, saying, "I was wrong." And the words did not hang heavy. They landed where they needed to, plain and honest, and Ethan looked at him for a moment, not measuring, not judging, just seeing. And then he gave a small nod, not as acceptance or dismissal, but as acknowledgement, because some things do not need to be answered. And the man exhaled, as if that was enough, as if being seen without being corrected carried its own weight. And around them the others began to move with more certainty, adjusting blankets, checking on one another, small gestures that spoke of something regained. And outside, the mountain stood unchanged in its indifference, the storm gone but not forgotten, its presence marked in every drift, every buried path. And Ethan rose then, moving toward the door, unbolting it slowly, the sound softer now in the quiet morning. And when he opened it, the cold air returned, but it was different, lighter, no longer pressing, just present. And Ranger stood immediately, stepping beside him, looking out over the ridge with that same steady gaze, as if confirming what the night had already proven. And behind them the group gathered near the doorway, not rushing out, not eager to leave, because something had changed in the way they understood where they stood. And the man who had once laughed reached out, his hand brushing briefly against the wall beside the door, the thick wood reinforced with something stronger beneath. And he shook his head slightly, almost to himself, saying it was never foolish. And no one corrected him, because now they all saw it, not just the cabin, but the quiet truth it held. That preparation is not fear, that strength is often mistaken for excess until the moment it becomes necessary. And Ethan stepped out onto the snow first, boots pressing into the surface with steady certainty, Ranger moving beside him, and one by one the others followed. Not because they were told to, but because they understood now what it meant to trust something built not for comfort, but for the moment when comfort fails. And as they moved into the open morning, the cabin stood behind them, unchanged, quiet, holding its place on the ridge without needing to prove anything at all, because some things are not meant to be admired, only relied on when it matters most.